Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our workshop, Reaching Canada's Protected Areas Target, Working with Municipalities. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your evening to join us for this informational session to discuss the important role that the Nature Network can play in helping to achieve Canada's commitment to protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 through the support and engagement of your local municipalities. Before we begin, I would like to formally acknowledge the lands and waters that I am situated on today. I am calling in from the area known as Wilmot Region, which resides on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I would like to acknowledge that I am located on Dish with One Spoon territory. This treaty is a peace agreement made between Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should only take what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. Through this land acknowledgement, our intent is to honor and show gratitude to the original stewards of the lands and waters as a sign of respect and willingness to learn and heal. The lands and waters from which we speak from today have been protected by Indigenous stewards since time immemorial. Together, may we continue to care for this land and each other by recognizing these original agreements and stewards, being mindful of generations to come. I would also like to acknowledge our project funder, the Greenbelt Foundation. We are grateful for their contribution and support, and we would not be able to do the work we do without their generosity. Today is also International Women's Day. This is a day to celebrate the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all the strong, intelligent, and talented women in our lives and thank them for their empowerment. Thank you to all the women out there who challenged the status quo and continue to pave the way for generations of women to come. As Leslie said, my name is Jenna Kipp, and I'm the Protected Places Assessment Coordinator. I've been involved in Canada's Protected Areas project for roughly a year now and have been working with municipalities and conservation authorities to have their conservation efforts recognized at a federal level. I'd also like to introduce you to the other speakers on this call, our Conservation Policy and Planning Manager, Karina Madar, who most of you will be introduced to for the first time tonight, as well as my wonderful colleague, Sarah Hasnack, our Conservation Planning Coordinator. Through this meeting, we would like to inform the Nature Network about the work that Ontario Nature has been doing to assist and support municipalities in contributing to Canada's Protected Areas target. We will be hearing more detail about this target from Karina in a few moments, but if you aren't already familiar, this target is a federal commitment to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, and it's frequently referred to as the 30 by 30 target. We would also like to seek your input on the readiness of your local municipality's ability to contribute to this target. We will have an opportunity for these discussions through breakout rooms, as well as a follow-up survey in which we would truly appreciate if you took a few minutes to fill out at the end of our presentation. Finally, we want to better understand the Nature Network's interest and capacity to engage with their local municipality and to encourage and support them to participate in the 30 by 30 target. To start the presentation, we'll be doing some background context on Canada's biodiversity targets and the importance of protected areas. Following this background, we'll be discussing the opportunities for municipalities to contribute to the target, as well as how the Nature Network can support their local municipalities in this incentive. Then Sarah will be taking us through a few case studies of the municipalities that Ontario Nature has worked with to highlight the best policies and practices that protect biodiversity in an urban setting. There will then be an opportunity for discussion through breakout rooms in which an Ontario Nature staff member will moderate conversations around the best practices and success stories of conservation efforts in your local municipalities, as well as a discussion about how we can further inspire municipalities to engage in this work. There will then be an opportunity to ask any questions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to add them in the chat as we go along and we'll address them at the end. As I said before, we'll be finishing the meeting tonight by circulating a survey when the presentation ends. It should only take 3 to 5 minutes to complete, and it'll really help us gain some information on the readiness of local municipalities to contribute to the 30-30 target, including the opportunities and barriers, as well as your understanding your interest in contributing to this project or where your group may require support. We have a really quick poll to help us better understand our audience's familiarity with the 30 by 30 target, as well as gauge how closely you work with your local municipalities. So the first question should just be popping up here in a sec, and it is, how would you rate your awareness of Canada's protected areas target? I'll just give this a moment to be filled in. Oh, and it looks like the second question is also popping up at the same time, and that is, does your group participate in local advocacy or otherwise engage with your local municipal representatives? Okay, so it looks like the majority of people are somewhere familiar with this target, and a few of you have actually engaged with this target and have completed some work with it. That's great to hear. And it also looks like frequently and occasionally are the most prominent answers for the second question there. Okay, that's great to know. Thank you so much for your participation in that. Oh, there we go. There's the results for anybody curious. Okay, there we go. I will now be passing it over to Karina to discuss the project background and the important context of protected areas.
Great, thanks, Jenna. And you'll jump in if you can't hear me. You see my lips are moving, so you know I'm talking. Okay, good. Great. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here tonight, and thank you for spending part of your evening with us. I'm going to give a broad overview of Canada's biodiversity targets, and specifically 30 by 30. So I'm really happy to see that most of you have some familiarity with this. So I think then most of you will have heard on the news in December that global leaders met in Montreal in December to negotiate the new global biodiversity framework. And Canada was a real leader at that. And as part of that framework, there are 23 ambitious targets to halt and prevent biodiversity loss. And one of them that gets a lot of attention is Target 3. So next slide, please. So this target 3, is 30 by 30. It's the commitment by countries that have signed on to this agreement to protect 30% of their lands and waters by the year 2030. And I'm actually joining this call from Ottawa. I'm at an event with other nature organizations, so the other sister groups to Ontario Nature, along with Nature Canada, where we're meeting with decision makers to press for real commitments to these biodiversity targets, including 30 by 30. So hopefully you'll see news coming out of that, including an action plan and possibly legislation. So 30 by 30 is super ambitious target. We previously had 20 by 2020, which you probably heard of, and we didn't meet that. I'll give some stats on where we are in a moment. So this 30 by 30% of our lands and waters protected and conserved means finding areas that contribute to biodiversity and connectivity, and doing so in a way that acknowledges and respects Indigenous rights and territories. And it also makes sure that any uses in those areas that are counted are sustainable and don't take away from the biodiversity and conservation outcomes that those areas are meant to achieve. And later on in the talk, Jenna will explain a bit more about how we determine that. So next slide, please, Jenna. So here's where we are right now. So 20 by 20, these are our stats as of 2022. So we didn't get there. And there's a lot of hope and maybe even some optimism that with this new agreement and with Canada being such a leader in its negotiation, that there will be more real effort to meet these targets. And so right now we're just at less than 11% of Ontario protected. And as you can see, the big chunks are in Northern Ontario. So you can see Polar Bear Provincial Park and the Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area there in Lake Superior. And you can see in the more populated part of Ontario, there's just little tiny bits and there's not a lot protected. And so that's part of why we want to work with municipalities. We won't add big numbers in the populated parts of Ontario, but those parts really count because they're our nearby nature and it's where a lot of our biodiversity is held. So next slide, please. So this matters not just to Southern Ontario municipalities. I know we have members joining from all over the province. These contributing to the 30 by 30 target, it's great that it adds up to this 30% number, but the 23 biodiversity targets that are in the global biodiversity framework, they all connect to each other and contribute to each other. So even if a very small parcel of land near your municipality doesn't add a lot to Canada's percent, it still matters to you and your local area. And as you can see, here's a picture of Wolf Lake near Sudbury. And, you know, if it gets added to the 30 by 30, it's not going to increase the percent by a lot, but it matters a lot to our Nature Network members in that area and to other people to whom Wolf Lake is special. And these areas that we're counting by working with municipalities contribute to the other 23 biodiversity targets, which we don't have time to get into today. So we really want to work with you, and we are working to help municipal leaders understand the opportunity and the role that they can play. So next slide, please. Having said that, you know, Southern Ontario really is a special case because it is where so much of our population is centered and where the development is. There's so many different land uses, and we won't even talk about Bill 23 tonight because we want this to be uplifting and positive. But we also know it's where our highest levels of biodiversity in Ontario and Canada are, and where a lot of our species at risk are. And so these smaller parcels relative to those big green areas you saw, they really matter. Next slide, please. And so given that, Ontario Nature is really happy to have recently worked with a coalition of other groups in Southern Ontario to develop a vision for how an interconnected network of protected conserved areas could look, specifically in the greater Golden Horseshoe area. And it's really interesting, the progressive ideas that were developed, and they are reported in this report. You can see the cover here, and it's accessible at the website link that you can see there. And the work that we're discussing tonight and that we're hoping that you'll help us champion kind of helps further this vision of a near urban network of natural areas that are conserved and count towards Canada's targets. So next slide, please. And so why are we talking to you about municipalities tonight? Well, your voices are very powerful. And as you know, that the Nature Network has been really effective in pressuring and encouraging municipal leaders to make or reverse decisions that are harmful to nature, to make decisions that are good for nature. And there are many recent examples, like with minister zoning orders. And so we're hoping to harness the collective power of our member groups to really champion this idea of getting municipalities on board with the 30 by 30 target. And, you know, as members who are situated in places that you know and love, you also have an important role in identifying areas that are candidates to be recognized, and also providing information about those areas. And so next slide, please. And so Jenna and Sarah and Belle, who you all also know, have been working really hard for several years now to engage with municipalities on this work, on the previous 20 by 20 target and now on 30 by 30. And they've already held a similar webinar with municipal leaders to get them excited about this. And now we're hoping by speaking to you that you will also bring that message forward from your own voice. And so these are some of the messages we brought to municipalities about why would they get involved. And I think, you know, this audience gets it, but these are the messages that we share with people who aren't necessarily involved in conservation. And so the first one, you can read them all, and I think some of them will be obvious to you, but the first one about addressing climate change, we talk about nature-based solutions. And so local natural areas store carbon and help mitigate the worst effects of extreme weather. You know, there's studies on the economic benefits of natural areas, but I think the one I really want to point out here is for the municipalities that have already participated in this, they're quite proud of their good work, and they like to, you know, talk about what they're doing and be recognized for their good work. So the first municipality was the City of London that did this kind of work, and since then, more municipalities have got on board and are quite proud of what they've done. And by showing that they're leaders in conservation, it puts them in a good position for future funding opportunities for biodiversity work. And then the next slide. So there's different ways we want municipalities to get involved. And so we're sharing these with you so that you can help spread that message too. So they could publicly support the 30 by 30 target. And municipalities actually did that, not Ontario municipalities, other ones during COP15. As they update their policies and plans, if they can embed commitments there, not necessarily to protect 30% of their land base themselves, but at least to contribute. And then there's many municipally conserved areas that might actually already count and just need to be assessed. And Jenna's going to explain what that means in a minute. And finally, for lands that municipalities manage that almost count but don't quite meet the mark, there's an opportunity for them to kind of up their game and improve protections on those lands. So I will pass it to Jenna now, and she'll kind of explain what we mean by counting. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Karina. So what types of municipal land can count towards the 30 by 30 target? There are two main categories that conserved land can fall into, either as a protected area or an other effective conservation measure, which is frequently referred to as an OECM. I'll be spending the next few minutes just explaining the difference between these types of land and what can be submitted, as well as the criteria that a municipality would need to meet in order to qualify. So the difference between these two classifications is the primary purpose of the area. Protected areas must have conservation as their main objective. They might be the conservation areas of conservation authorities, land trust properties, or municipally owned parks and conservation lands. Quite a few conservation authorities have already had their lands assessed to count towards the target as protected areas, such as Wainfleet Bog, owned and managed by the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, and Glen Haffey Conservation Area, run by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Land trusts, since their goal are to conserve natural areas, can also assess their sites towards the protected areas target. Since their assessment, all of Ontario Nature's 26 properties now count towards this target. As Karina was saying before, the first municipality to contribute towards the federal target was the City of London, which had 11 sites assessed. These sites were designated as environmentally significant areas on the municipal level and provincially significant wetlands or areas of natural and scientific interest on the provincial level. So alone, these provincial designations aren't enough to qualify a site. but added together with layers of municipal policies, these sites can count. More and more municipalities are now having some of their properties assessed towards the target, but the recognition of municipally owned conservation lands is far from complete in Ontario. And while protected areas must have a primary conservation objective, this isn't the case for OECMs. OECMs may be managed for different objectives, such as recreation or research, but must deliver the effective conservation of biodiversity while meeting their other primary objectives of the site. A great example of an OECM that some of you may be familiar with is the Queen's University Biological Station. It was established for research, but it meets the required criteria to conserve biodiversity, so it counts towards the federal target. A few other sites now recognized as OECMs in Ontario include Scanlon Creek Conservation Area, Warsaw Caves, and the special management zones within Northumberland County Forest. In order to qualify as a protected area or an OECM, the site must meet the following 4 criteria. So first, the area must have clearly defined boundaries to be submitted for an assessment. Having the property officially demarcated in GIS is a must, as the boundaries need to be submitted to a geographic database to count. Secondly, it must be demonstrated that there are effective means to control all activities likely to negatively impact biodiversity, such as the development or an unauthorized use of an area. Wording within official plans and bylaws are often drawn on as evidence for this criterion. Protection must also be long-term, year-round, and difficult to reverse. So this criterion is assessed by looking at how long a particular site has been managed for conservation and the overall intent of applicable management plans and policies, as well as how difficult it would be for a reversal of all protective mechanisms to occur. And finally, the last criterion that must be met is that the site is managed by the governing authority so that conservation outcomes are achieved. To demonstrate that the municipality or governing authority is meeting its biodiversity conservation goals, evidence from biological inventories, citizen science observations, site-specific management plans, or natural heritage system studies are of use. Throughout the past year of working on assessments, we have learned that there are many key challenges at play for Southern Ontario municipalities wishing to have their lands assessed and counted towards Canada's protected areas target. Firstly, gathering all the necessary documents and compiling an assessment can be time-consuming and may not be an option for some municipalities that have limited staff capacity to take this on. Second, not all municipal lands are solely owned by the municipality. For any site to be considered, all landowners must consent to having their lands assessed and counted, and they must be committed to the long-term protection of the site, which can create some complications when there are multiple landowners involved. Municipalities may also have conflicting interests for how their land should be managed. Some municipalities are looking for opportunities to expand development, and so priorities would need to be sorted out. Some municipalities lack strong environmental protection policies that would make their conservation lands suitable for consideration. For example, they may be challenged to demonstrate that the long-term intent is to manage these lands for conservation. In such cases, the policies would need to be strengthened. But despite all of these challenges, we've worked with several Southern Ontario municipalities to successfully screen their conservation lands. During the breakout rooms or the follow-up survey, we would love to hear your thoughts on how these barriers and challenges can be addressed and how we can work together to support our local municipalities. Ontario Nature has been working with municipalities towards Canada's protected areas target since 2020. And since then, we have completed assessments for the municipalities of Kitchener, Lambton, Brampton, Guelph, and Toronto, as well as regional counties of Northumberland and Dufferin. Some of these assessments, such as Kitchener, Toronto, Lambton, and Northumberland, are already contributing to the target, while the rest are still in submission phase, waiting approval from the provincial government. Ontario Nature has also recently become involved in a national collaborative effort convened by Nature Canada. It's known as MPAP, the Municipal Protected Areas Project. This working group also includes the Alliance of Canadian Land Trusts, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society's Wildlands League, and BC Nature. The objective of this collaborative partnership is to find where there's potential to secure municipal commitments of support for the 30 by 30 target, and also where there's potential for municipalities to contribute their lands to the target. Ontario Nature is really uniquely positioned in this agreement, as we've already worked with several municipalities and conservation authorities to assess their lands. Also, under the scope of this work, Ontario Nature has completed a municipal policy analysis for all 110 municipalities within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, as well as an additional 20 municipalities across Southern Ontario. This analysis looks at the strengths of environmental protection within policies and plans, as well as the ownership of high-quality natural areas to determine which municipalities would have the best chance of being accepted into the database, or if they're still working to meet the standard, and if they might need a little bit more time to strengthen their environmental policies to be candidates for this work. Based on our results of the analysis for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, we've determined that there are approximately 35 municipalities that aren't quite ready, but 55 maybes and 20 municipalities that are eligible. So many Southern Ontario municipalities are almost meeting the requirements, and we just need a little extra help to help them become candidate for this work. And finally, Ontario Nature has been identifying and promoting the best practices that we have seen so far within our work. These types of best practices range greatly from municipality to municipality, but I'll stop there because Sarah will be going into more detail about them soon. If the Nature Network would like to contribute to this project, here are a few things that they could do to support this work. So firstly, the Nature Network could build local awareness and support. Another barrier for this work is the lack of awareness. Many municipalities aren't aware of the 30 by 30 target or that they may contribute to it. This effort may be presentations, sharing information on social media, or writing editorials to your local municipal staff or community members. Creating a broad base of community support and actively voicing your desire to see this goal met can put pressure on local municipal leaders to improve protections and land management practices. Active and local voices can make a huge difference in this work. For example, you may remember when the Nature Network helped rally against the proposed development in the Dufferins Creek or Cataraqui provincially significant wetlands and successfully fought against it, making a significant difference in the local environment. If you do choose to reach out to your local municipality, we recommend getting in contact with the municipal clerk, as they're obligated by statute to forward this information to council. Throughout this effort, the Nature Network could also share resources created by Ontario Nature with their municipal governments, such as the best practices identified within this webinar, to provide examples of what can be done on a municipal level to support local protected areas. The Nature Network can also offer their expertise to their local municipalities. There's a capacity challenge for many municipalities to collect biodiversity data for their properties, which is a problem that will be further exacerbated by Bill 23 and the new restrictions on the role of conservation authorities. The Nature Network could assist with site monitoring or the collection of data to get their local municipalities more prepared to commit to the 30 by 30 target. You can also provide your expertise and perspectives by participating in local planning processes, commenting on proposed changes to land use and planning documents, or presenting in person to council with actionable results. And finally, the Nature Network can help advise Ontario Nature about the readiness of your local municipality. If you feel like your municipality has strong environmental policies or owns large areas for conservation, we would really appreciate your input. Also, if there are any key leaders that stand out to you in your local municipal government, Ontario Nature is keen to connect with them to see what can be done within their community. Ontario Nature can support the efforts of the Nature Network by providing tools and examples of the best practices that municipalities are currently doing that allows them to successfully qualify for this target. If you're unsure if your municipality would meet the criteria for this target, Ontario Nature can also assist with initial analysis of their policy strengths and weaknesses to see what work may need to be done in order for them to contribute to the target. We'll be continuing to work with interested nature network groups to strategize the best ways to engage with local municipalities and encourage them to support the target, as well as continuing to connect the nature network with the national effort put forward by the Municipal Protected Areas project that I mentioned. And I'll now be passing it off to Sarah to discuss some of those best practices.
Great, thank you, Jenna. So yeah, as Jenna said, I'm going to spend the next maybe 15 or so minutes talking about some municipalities who have already stepped up to the plate to contribute to the 30 by 30 target. And I'll be highlighting some of the best practices we've seen in Ontario to date, just based on our work so far. And that kind of provides a bit of a model for other municipalities who might want to increase protection of their natural areas to meet the federal target, or who might be doing the same things and can already qualify some of their lands. So there are several municipalities who already own and protect lands that can contribute to the federal target, and that shows that this is not a goal that's entirely out of reach. Several municipal leaders are already out there doing this work and providing some really great examples for other municipalities who would want to pursue this initiative. In 2021, Ontario Nature supported the submissions of conservation lands to the 30 by 30 target for several municipalities, and that included the City of Toronto, Northumberland County, and the City of Kitchener, and those have all successfully been accepted and counted towards the target. And the lands that count for each of those municipalities is shown in green on those maps. So the City of Toronto had contributed over 850 hectares of parks that are owned by the city and or the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and they're largely defined by locally identified environmentally significant areas. Northumberland County has contributed over 400 hectares of county forest tracts that have been identified and protected as special management zones based on their biodiversity and ecosystem values. And the City of Kitchener has contributed over 500 hectares of city-owned parks designated as natural area parks. Ontario Nature has also continued to support additional submissions towards the target over the past year, and that's what Jenna and I have been busy working on a lot of our time. And the maps shown here now are of 3 examples of municipalities currently in the process of submitting lands to the target, with the lands that are kind of in progress being shown in a kind of purplish blue color. So you can see City of Toronto is here again. So we're working with them this year to submit another 540 hectares of city and or Toronto and Region Conservation Authority owned parks. And again, they're largely defined by environmentally significant areas. In the middle, you can see that Brampton is working with us to submit an impressive 1,925 hectares of their natural heritage system, representing some of the city's highest quality conservation lands that are owned by either the city or, again, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And finally, we have also the City of Guelph, who will be submitting 274 hectares of city-owned parks and properties within the natural heritage system. And I'll just note for these ones that we don't know yet whether they will be accepted officially towards the target or not, but based on our past experience and expertise, we're pretty optimistic about the outcome for all 3. So these municipalities, Brampton, Guelph, Kitchener, Toronto, and Northumberland County, have contributed a pretty sizable amount of conservation lands towards the target. 1,874 hectares have officially been accepted towards the federal target from these 5 municipalities alone, and another 2,729 hectares are in various stages of being assessed and submitted. So, and that doesn't even encompass every municipality who has submitted lands to date. Those are just 5 good examples that we've worked with. Contributions from municipalities are especially important in Southern Ontario, where those federally recognized conservation lands are really lacking, as Karina had pointed out earlier on. And we're really hoping that by showcasing the best practices that have allowed these municipalities to be successful, other municipalities across the province will be encouraged to participate as well. So as I think Jenna had said, promoting and highlighting some of the best practices here is one way that we really feel that you, our nature network groups, can help to encourage your local municipalities to participate. And this slide introduces some of those important best practices that we've observed to date. So establishing a strategy for acquiring natural areas into city ownership or town ownership is really critical if a city wants to submit lands towards the target. And that could be through purchasing lands, accepting donations or dedications, or other strategies of acquiring land. Implementing protective zoning and other designations to identify specific areas for long-term protection and conservation is also critical to ensuring those municipal lands can qualify for the target. Additional bylaws can also help your local municipality to prevent incompatible activities or site alterations in natural areas. Consistently incorporating goals to conserve and enhance natural areas in planning and management strategies, and pursuing additional environmental initiatives can help prove your municipality is committed to ensuring their decisions maximize conservation values. Creating a strategy to regularly monitor and manage natural areas is also really important to provide evidence of how effectively that land is actually providing conservation values on the land, and what management actions are being taken to maintain and enhance that value. And finally, establishing partnerships with organizations like a local conservation authority or an educational institution can help a municipality to expand upon monitoring and management efforts. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time explaining each of those best practices in some detail and providing some examples of how they kind of crop up in those 5 municipalities I mentioned earlier on. And that starts at the top of the list with ensuring that there's a mechanism to acquire natural lands. So this one's really important because it helps to eliminate or minimize, at the very least, conflicting land management goals. So if the city is the primary or only owner and manager of the land being submitted, they'll have direct control over how it's used and can ensure the conservation goals are made a priority. Most of the municipalities we've worked with to date have been sole owners of their natural lands, or they might share ownership with their local conservation authority. But there are 2 pretty exceptional examples of municipalities who have acquired natural lands for conservation. First is the City of Toronto, which has a really long history of purchasing natural lands for conservation purposes. This is a straightforward and direct approach to acquiring land and has worked really well in the city, as several of the properties they've submitted to the target have been owned and managed by the city since the 1940s to 1960s. And the second example is the City of Brampton, and they've actually got a policy in their official plan that requires developers to transfer any valley lands or watercourse corridors identified on their development site to the city. And not only that, but the developer has to ensure those lands are in an acceptable natural state before they're transferred to city ownership. This has worked really well to ensure the city can control what happens to these natural areas and corridors, and it's created a large network of city-owned natural areas that can be submitted to the target. Next, it's really important to ensure your municipality is using their zoning bylaw and other land designations, as well as other bylaws, to identify and protect specific areas for conservation. By doing this, the city establishes legal mechanisms to prevent activities that might be incompatible with biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. And the zoning bylaw is an especially important tool because it allows the city to directly control what type of development is or is not allowed on particular parcels of land. So again, some examples. We've got some really strong zoning in the city of Kitchener and in the city of Guelph. So the Kitchener zoning bylaw establishes a natural heritage conservation zone, and that's where there's no new development permitted except for conservation uses on that land. They've also used their official plan and their park's strategic plan to establish a classification system for their parks to categorize different parcels into different uses. And that's how they've created this natural areas park designation, which identifies parks with the primary goal of protecting natural areas. They're then able to set aside those natural area parks for long-term conservation purposes, making them eligible for that 30 by 30 target, while other parks are used to provide more active recreational spaces and facilities, but wouldn't necessarily count towards a target. In the city of Guelph, their current zoning bylaw contains wetland, conservation land, and floodway zoning categories that all significantly limit permitted land uses. And the most protective one out of those is the wetland zone that prohibits all land uses except for wetland conservation, flood control, conservation authority approved trails, and wildlife management. But the city is also working to update their zoning bylaw right now, and the draft bylaw establishes an even broader protective zoning category, which would prohibit new development except for conservation uses in the whole natural heritage system. So that's pretty exciting to see. And then in addition to those protective zoning categories, Brampton has a woodlot conservation bylaw, and Toronto has a ravine and natural feature protection bylaw to regulate the removal or alteration of trees, vegetation, and other natural qualities of the site, and kind of lays out which conditions alterations would or wouldn't be allowed. So for example, they can prohibit commercial logging while permitting the removal of hazard trees or tree planting events, because it's a positive alteration, but an alteration nonetheless. And many municipalities as well, including Brampton and Toronto, will also implement a parks bylaw, and that kind of sets out the rules and regulations for visitor behaviors in city parks and natural areas. And that could mean requiring all dogs to remain on a leash so that they don't disturb wildlife or other visitors, prohibiting littering and dumping in the parks, or prohibiting the use of ATVs or other off-road motorized vehicles on trails. And those types of rules and regulations could also exist in their own bylaws, like an off-leash dog bylaw or a littering bylaw. So our next example of a best practice that you could promote to your local municipality is to incorporate and prioritize conservation of natural areas in their management plans and strategies. And this is just a really important step to ensuring that conservation goals are consistently considered when municipal staff and leaders are making land use planning decisions and management decisions. Here we've got a couple more examples again, where municipalities have effectively layered conservation goals in their planning documents. First is the city of Guelph, which emphasizes and prioritizes the conservation of natural areas in their community plan, their strategic plan, natural heritage action plan, urban forest management plan, parks plan, and trails plan. And similarly, the city of Brampton has emphasized conservation goals in their Grow Green Environmental Master Plan, Natural Heritage and Environmental Management Strategy, the Brampton Eco Park Strategy, and the Urban Forest Management Plan. So encouraging your municipality to incorporate written commitments to conservation in multiple planning documents like these two municipalities have. It's important to enshrine conservation goals in the decision-making processes affecting natural lands. Similarly, encouraging your municipality to pursue additional environmental and conservation initiatives is a really great way to promote biodiversity conscious decision-making within and beyond the natural areas you want to see protected. And this part's not super critical to allowing municipal lands to count towards the 30 by 30 target, but it's just another great way to show off your municipality's commitment to fostering an ecologically sustainable community and a local culture of conservation and stewardship. For example, in Northumberland County, they've achieved Forest Stewardship Council or FSC certification of their county forest. And this helps to ensure that where logging is allowed outside of those more strongly protected special management zones, which were the areas that can count towards the target, the county is managing those activities to minimize impacts on the environment well enough to meet the standards for certification. The City of Kitchener and the City of Guelph have both achieved the B City of Canada designation for their pollinator conservation efforts within and beyond natural heritage systems. And the City of Guelph is also a designated bird-friendly city for their efforts to create and maintain bird habitats and to minimize the negative effects of built areas on birds that are in the area. And lastly, the City of Brampton coordinates a number of community stewardship initiatives, including their Grow Green Network, Grow Green Environmental Awards Program, Brampton 1 Million Trees Program, their Adopt a Park program, and Parks Environmental Education Program. All right, so we're almost at the end. I know I've been talking for a little while, but we're getting close, and there's only 2 more best practices to kind of go over here. And this one's about making sure that your municipality has a way to effectively monitor and manage natural areas to ensure that conservation outcomes are being achieved on the ground. And that's especially challenging in an urban environment. But proving that effective biodiversity conservation is actually occurring on the ground there is an important component of submitting lands to the 30 by 30 target, as it shows that the lands we're counting towards a target are actually valuable and high functioning ecosystems and habitats. The City of Toronto has a long history of monitoring and managing their natural areas. The city has identified, inventoried, managed, and protected their locally identified environmentally significant areas over the past 40 years. And they've also actively worked to manage invasive species in natural areas for the last 20 years. And then the second example is City of Guelph, which has recently conducted a natural assets inventory to evaluate the condition and value of their natural areas. And the city has also been carefully managing invasive species. For example, the Emerald Ash Borer Management Program has included removing only hazardous trees while leaving some of the dead wood from those tree removals on the ground to maintain natural forest structure. And then helping to rehabilitate heavily impacted areas by planting native species. And the last best practice I want to highlight today is seeking out partnerships to support municipal conservation initiatives. So this is important because it can really expand a municipality's capacity to conduct monitoring and management activities, especially in smaller, short-staffed or resource-constrained cities and towns. So there are 2 really awesome examples we've seen, one in Toronto and one in Brampton. So the City of Toronto often partners with Toronto and Region Conservation Authority to support biodiversity and ecosystem monitoring in the city's natural areas. And they've also just recently partnered with the University of Toronto to establish long-term monitoring plots in natural areas across the city. In Brampton, the city has partnered with their 2 local conservation authorities, which are the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority and Credit Valley Conservation, as well as Ontario Streams to support city-led restoration projects throughout the natural heritage system. These partnerships and cooperation among organizations really helps to increase those resources available for monitoring and support of natural areas. And one idea we had was that interested nature network groups could consider playing kind of a partnership role in this regard, especially given the reduced ability of conservation authorities to collaborate with municipalities due to Bill 23. This could be a really interesting opportunity depending on the relationship that your group has with your local municipality, the municipality's level of interest, and the group's availability to take the job on as well. So any feedback you have on this or other ideas that you have about ways that you could support or encourage your municipalities to participate would be really great to hear about in the next section of the workshop, which is our breakout rooms. And on that note, I will pass back to Jenna to coordinate that little portion of our evening.
Thanks, Sarah. So we have some time set aside now for the group discussions, but we know that was an awful lot of information to throw at you. So if there's any pressing questions that you would like answered before we jump into the breakout rooms, please feel free to use the raise hand feature or just throw it into the chat. I'll just give just a few seconds, see if anybody identifies themselves.
Yeah, and maybe while we wait for that, Brendan did put a great question in there about the economic benefits, and we kind of gave the generic answer that is about really the economic benefits of natural areas. And I think the point with this is to recognize the good work that municipalities are already doing. So really, there's not an economic cost to doing this except for some staff time. In terms of comprehensive review of, all the different resources out there that explain the value of nature. We haven't done that. And so what we're hoping with this project is to identify those municipalities that already kind of get it and encourage them to have their areas count. And I don't want to say more because I see there's a lot of hands raised and I want to leave time for those questions. I think Tony was first.
I just want to add on to yours really quick there, Karina. For the economic incentive for municipalities to participate, there's no funding or anything from the federal government to participate, but we are hoping that by contributing to the target, that municipalities will be more well positioned to ask for funding because of their designation. So hopefully that's able to give you a little bit of insight. And yes, Tony, would you like to unmute yourself and
Sure.
ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I live in the city of Toronto and been active in different issues in the city. So is really the agreement to participate, which I'm kind of surprised to hear how much Toronto has agreed to. Is this more of an aspirational goal, meaning that you know that you're getting lands agreed that are covered by this concept, but they may not be yet doing enough to make them properly conserved? Because I can certainly say the ESAs in Toronto do not have management plans, for example, even though they are intended to, and and they do make efforts to get rid of invasive species and different things. But it would be hard to say that they've met a goal, that these lands are properly being conserved. So is it like, so I'm just, anyway, if you could explain, I mean, I is it like trying to build momentum and get people on board and then say, well, you could do more, or I don't know, because it just doesn't, anyway, if you could just explain that a bit, because I don't think Toronto really is meeting the goal, even though they've put their hand in or something.
No, I completely understand that concern, Tony. So thank you for that question. I see Karina unmuted herself there. So if you would like to answer that, please go ahead.
I can, and then if any of you want to add on. Yeah, it's a good question. And we do this work based on the best available information. We don't visit the sites on the ground ourselves, and we recognize that some areas that get counted are better than others, but based on all the information we have on the condition, on the policies in place, we're really just counting what actually does seem to count based on the standard assessment protocol and the information available. So you as a person on the ground in Toronto might see that, oh, they're not really doing what they should be for this to really count. There will be some discrepancies, but we hope through doing like the thorough work that Jenna and Sarah do that, areas don't slip through the cracks that shouldn't count. And I'll speak from my experience. I worked for the province on this previously before joining Ontario Nature. And so I worked with the people that were screening the City of Kitchener sites. And we did look closely. We realized based on it's a desktop exercise, we realized, some of these just, they don't cut it. And we really tried to pick the very best examples. So, and I think the same is true for Toronto, that it's not all of their ESAs. I think it's the best ones. And Jenna, Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, we didn't even exactly look directly at the ESAs. It was Toronto parks with a certain percentage covered by the ESA. And I think it's also important to note in Southern Ontario how biodiversity around here really needs to be protected. And if it comes down to including these areas that may have some invasive species or may not look like they're doing everything for conservation, we still want to encourage and support them to contribute. We make sure that they have protocols in place to continue to make way towards their conservation goals. So making sure they have invasive species management plans and are regularly out there on the properties doing what they can to make sure that they are going and moving towards their conservation goals is very important too. Okay, and if neither of you have anything else to add, I will go to Ellen next. I see you have your hand up as well.
Thank you. Yes, and this is a terrific evening. I thank you very much for the initiative. I think the overall initiative of involving municipalities and the 30 by 30 goal is spectacular. Good on you. And then at this, this next breath, I'm going to say that I'm entirely with Tony, and I'm with the Toronto Field Naturalists. So I'm the past president. We have a lot of experience with Toronto's environmentally significant areas. And so we have a far more jaundiced view of what they do than what you're describing. And we have many experts who know what is going on and not going on the ground. So I'm also, we're all sufficiently, we're all grown-ups. We understand good cop, bad cop. We understand the push and pull of policy, and all of that needs to happen. So I completely get it that, it's important to accredit municipalities for good aspirations and good things they do. But at least 3 of us on this call this evening are coming fresh from the trenches with the Toronto Island Master Plan, which is an area that has no less than 6 of Toronto's environmentally significant areas. And this is a 30-year plan being developed with wholly inadequate protections for nature, and with all kinds of plans for new pressures, user pressures. And we actually do want to, Toronto Field Naturalists, we actually do want to apply the 30 by 30 target to the Toronto Islands and say, why don't we do that? Why don't we do that to the islands? I mean, what's stopping us? Because right now the island, the Toronto Island is at 11 or 12% nature. So this is all commentary, and I don't really, I don't expect you to answer, but we'd love to talk more. There's a lot to talk about, and a lot of it has to do with positioning, with recognizing that, yes, on the one hand, excellent that you're moving forward. On the other hand, you're not monitoring, you municipality. You haven't monitored, you haven't inventoried for decades. And calling a spade wherever we see it.
Thank you so much for those insights, Ellen. I completely agree, and we would love to have a further conversation with you about this. If you like, you can indicate your interest in the survey afterwards, or you could reach out to Leslie or I through our emails, and we can get in contact and make that happen. And with that being said, we are now at 8 o'clock, so it is time to jump into the group discussions. We will have another 10 or 15 minutes after this to go over any other questions though. So the questions here are, do you know if your municipality already has any of these best practices that we've listed in place? And if so, which ones? Followed by, what do you perceive as your local government's greatest success to date for biodiversity conservation? And has your group previously worked with your municipality on those conservation projects? And